On the Zero Hour, I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. There is no more important story in the eyes of the world and in the conscience of the world right now than the horrific attacks that have been underway in Gaza. Here to discuss that story with me now is Ali Abunimah. Ali Abunimah is the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada website, which can be found at electronicintifada.net. He is also the author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine, published by Haymarket Books, and of the book One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse. So first of all, Ali, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ. And I've been a long-time viewer, and so I'm really happy to come on, though I wish it were in better circumstances.
As do I, as a longtime reader of your work and follower of your work. I feel exactly the same way. And let's get right into it, but maybe a little bit with context. It seems to me that here in the United States, as you and I both know well, reporting on Israel and Palestine has been biased in many ways, distorted in many ways. But there's another aspect, another flaw to that reporting that I think is important for people to be aware of, and that's that this is, as far as I understand it, as I perceive it, an ongoing struggle. A river that's been flowing for many years, that in fact has tributaries from other rivers, other independent struggles, and that while we only hear about it from time to time, a body count here or a photograph of a burning building there, that in fact what we're seeing now is merely the latest frame in an ongoing film of struggle. And I wonder, as we begin, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think one of the main flaws of US media coverage is that it erases all the context and presents this situation at best as being like some kind of incomprehensible religious struggle between two roughly equal groups at best, but usually that Israel is the victim and the Palestinians are the aggressors. And that is a complete reversal of the reality. And I think what is starting to cut through it, I feel like never before, is just the sheer horror of the hard reality of what's happening. And over the last 10 days of the Israeli bombardment campaign on Gaza, I've been in touch almost every day with friends and colleagues there. The Electronic Intifada has wonderful reporters we work with in Gaza, and I have friends there. And these are people who've lived through three major Israeli attacks on Gaza since 2008, including the one in 2014 that killed more than 2,200 people, including 550 children in the space of 51 days. And they all tell me this is the worst thing they've ever been through, that they go to bed at night, although nobody sleeps right now, convinced that they're not going to survive the night. The bombing is relentless. It's like a constant earthquake that never stops, that people's greatest fear is not being bombed, but being bombed and surviving to have to mourn, the rest of their family who's been wiped out, because they see that happening every day. Entire families have been wiped out. On early Sunday morning, Israel bombed Al-Wahda Street in Gaza City, destroying at least two residential buildings, killing almost 50 people, wiping out generations of families. One family, for example, the Al-Qawlaq family, lost more than 20 people in that one bombing attack, the youngest being 6 months old and the eldest being 84 years old. And one of the myths that is perpetrated by the media is that, Hamas, the bad guys, indiscriminately fire at civilians, whereas Israel, the good guys, do all they can to spare civilians. And that's just not true. Israel is targeting civilian homes. It's targeting high-rise apartment buildings and office buildings. It has destroyed Médecins Sans Frontières clinic. It after it bombed Al Wahda Street, it also bombed the roads from that area to Al Shifa Hospital. So that ambulances were unable to get to people in time to rescue them. So far, it has killed 2 doctors. Dr. Ayman Abul Auf was killed in his home in an Israeli bombing attack with 2 of his children. He's the head of internal medicine at Al Shifa Hospital, which is Gaza's main hospital. He was playing an essential role, not just in dealing with the more than 1,500 injuries from the current bombing attack, but also in the COVID response in Gaza, which was already catastrophic. And now you have tens of thousands of people displaced from their home. The health ministry has had to close down the COVID testing lab. People are obviously not going to get vaccinated when they're being bombed in this way. And now you have people sheltering in UNRWA schools in very poor conditions, which are just rife for another COVID catastrophe if and when this horrific bombing campaign ends. And people are starting to, people who never paid that much attention are starting to say, wait, Israel did what? They bombed the office of the Associated Press brazenly. They bombed the office of Al Jazeera brazenly. They're bombing everything in Gaza. And the reason for that is because there really are no military targets in Gaza. This is not a war in the classic sense. It is asymmetric warfare. Israel is trying to fight against a popular resistance movement, which is resisting military occupation and siege and colonialism. This is an anti-colonial struggle. And there's nothing for Israel to bomb into. There are no big military bases to bomb. The Palestinian resistance factions don't have warplanes sitting on the ground. They don't have columns of tanks to bomb. So Israel is implementing something called the Dahiya Doctrine, which was first implemented in 2006 in its war in Lebanon, when it basically destroyed the southern suburb of Beirut called the Dahiya. And the logic that was articulated by Israeli military strategists is that in this kind of asymmetric warfare, you have to cause such pain and agony to the civilian population, to the society at large, that people will never dare resist you again. And it has never worked. By the way, it didn't work for the United States in Vietnam, where it killed millions of people in Southeast Asia, carpet bombed them from B-52s. It didn't work for the French in Algeria, and it's not working for Israel either, because once a people has made the collective decision to free itself from colonial rule, societies tend to show that they're willing to pay an extraordinary price for that freedom and liberation.
You know, Ali Abunimah, I remember once I had Chris Hedges on this program, and I asked him about the kinds of people we see, whether they're revolutionaries or protesters or the man who stood in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. And I said, I understand the courage. I understand what might motivate that. What is striking about so many of these figures who live in daily fear of their life is that there's almost a kind of acceptance, a quality that just says, I can't be moved. That seems to me to be almost transcendent. And I'm wondering whether, in some sense, that's what we're seeing here after years of killing, after years of abuse, after years of deprivation, whether we're not just seeing a people, they're going through horrors, they're being traumatized, children are being traumatized, and so on. But I wonder if we're not just seeing at a point a kind of resolve that is in place. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And I can't speak to that from firsthand experience because I've not been in this situation. But I'll tell you, everyone I've talked to in Gaza, and you know, and also things I read and things I see, but people I've talked to personally tell me the same thing. And these are people who are, whether they're, they're just ordinary people. They're not, quote unquote heroes. Uh, and they say, this is the most horrendous thing we've ever been through. And we want it to stop. Of course, you want it to stop, but we do not want a surrender. We will not accept a ceasefire that is based on our surrender. So I think that's exactly the resolve you're talking about and that I see. And people in Gaza, we had a beautiful article explaining this by Ahmed Aburtema. He's a writer and a poet in Gaza. We published it at the Electronic Intifada. It's called This Time It's Different. And he explains, and by the way, he's one of the founders of the Great March of Return, which in 2018 was a mass nonviolent movement that mobilized tens of thousands of people in Gaza to march to the boundary with Israel to protest for an end to the Israeli siege and occupation and for Palestinian rights. And Israel responded to that nonviolent protest by sending military snipers to gun down more than 200 unarmed protesters. So he's one of the founders. He's someone who believes profoundly in nonviolence. But he said that people supported and even demanded that the resistance factions act when Israel escalated its assault in Jerusalem, which, remember, the rocket fire from Gaza was a response to Israel's escalating ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, currently focused on the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And he said people were demanding the resistance respond because they just know that, if you sit there and do nothing, that gives Israel a green light to wipe you out. And that brings us to the broader political context here, if I can shift to that.
Of course.
Less than a year ago, Donald Trump and Jared Kushner were celebrating the so-called Abraham Accords. These were normalization deals signed between Israel and various Gulf dictatorships, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and also Morocco. And although not formally with Saudi Arabia, with the full tacit support of Saudi Arabia. In other words, the speculation was, well, how soon is Saudi Arabia going to come out and join the party? Are they going to do that in 6 months, in a year? But there were already signs Saudi Arabia was heading that way. They were allowing Israel's airline El Al to start overflying Saudi airspace and so on. They thought they were celebrating this marriage to Israel really over the dead body of the Palestinian cause. Donald Trump, in his so-called deal of the century, was saying, oh, we've taken Jerusalem off the table, we've taken the right of return off the table. In other words, they all thought the Palestinian cause was dead, the Palestinians were isolated, were weak, that everyone had moved on from the issue of Palestine, and basically they could get on with the party of creating this, regional alliance of dictatorships plus Israel, all under the sponsorship of the United States, in order to make war against Iran. And I think all of that gave Israel the green light to think, well, we can accelerate our ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. We can accelerate the annexation and colonization of Palestinian land in the West Bank. And I think it was a major miscalculation because the resistance based in Gaza did respond, did fight back to protect Jerusalem. And what that did was it reawakened a sense of Palestinian national unity and consciousness that we have not seen in decades. So yesterday, as we're speaking now, which would have been May 18th, for the first time since the 1930s, Palestinians observed a general strike across the whole of historic Palestine. In other words, in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And we have seen the protests spread throughout Palestinian cities within Israel and throughout the West Bank, along with the resistance in Gaza. So this presents Israel really with a new situation that it is not ready for, and I believe not really capable of handling in the long term, because the Israeli strategy for what they would call conflict management, for keeping a lid on things, is not to resolve the question of Palestine justly, but rather to fragment the Palestinian population into isolated enclaves, classic colonial divide and rule. So
Right.
you had Gaza isolated from the West Bank. You have the West Bank broken up into little enclaves where the Palestinian Authority rules little patches of ground surrounded by the Israeli army. And then you have Palestinian citizens of Israel who are, sort of isolated in their own towns up in mostly in the north of Israel and not really connected to the rest of the Palestinian population. When that fragmentation breaks down and you start to develop a pan-Palestinian national consciousness, like now, Israel is in a sense fighting on three fronts to repress Palestinian resistance, and it risks turning into a situation of what was called ungovernability in the context of apartheid South Africa,
Right.
where the regime is capable of repressing Gaza or the West Bank or the Palestinians in Israel. But if it is engaged in repression of all three at the same time, you start to see really the cracks in the apartheid system or the colonial system widening.
And I guess maybe where to go from there to kind of conclude, Ali Abunimah, is by talking, in this country, our politicians still give fealty or obeisance to the two-state solution. Now, you many years ago, well ahead of the curve, wrote a book saying, one country was the solution. It seems to me that with the pattern of settlements and other seizings of Palestinian lands, so that right now many portions of Palestine look like they've been moth-eaten. They're just spots here and there. It seems to me the Israelis themselves, by doing that, have foreclosed any possibility of a two-state solution, and that really it may be that they understand that, and part of their strategy is to either destroy the will of the Palestinian people or drive them away because a two-state solution is no longer viable. Before we go, I'm curious your thoughts on that and what a positive outcome might look like.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Israel was determined for there never to be a two-state solution, which is why it set about colonizing the West Bank in the way it did in order to uh, foreclose that possibility, to make it impossible to create a contiguous Palestinian state. Well, congratulations, Israel, you succeeded. They erased
Right.
basically the distinction between the West Bank and Israel. And uh, we have the reality of a one-state solution, but it is an apartheid state. And in the past few months, in January, the well-known Israeli human rights group B'Tselem issued a report uh, concluding that Israel uh, practices the crime of apartheid under international law, and that its guiding principle everywhere where it has authority is the maintenance of Jewish supremacy over Palestinians. And in April, so we're talking about just a few weeks ago, Human Rights Watch, an incredibly mainstream organization, also issued a report concluding that
Right.
Israel practices the crime of apartheid, which is one of the high crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And of course, they were simply acknowledging something Palestinians have been saying for many, many decades, but people often don't take notice of what Palestinians say. They only pay attention if it's being said by somebody they consider more authoritative than a mere Palestinian.
Hmm.
And so I think that realization is now becoming unavoidable, and it is starting to ripple through American politics. Sadly, the political elites in the United States, when I talk about, whether you talk about the Republican leadership or the Democratic leadership, remain staunchly pro-Israel. But in recent years, there has been a dramatic shift at the base and through the broader society. And we're seeing that play out in the Democratic Party now, where for the first time, you're starting to see um, members of Congress talking about conditioning aid to Israel. I think that none of that talk goes far enough. We have to push them much, much harder. But I think it's a reflection that they feel they can no longer ignore the anger and outrage at the grassroots at what Israel has been doing for so long and with full American backing. And the bombs that are dropping on Gaza now as we speak are American bombs. Some people have been able to identify them, some of the particular types of bomb, including one called a GBU 31 bunker buster bomb, which is designed for penetrating, underground bunkers that Israel is using to destroy civilian apartment buildings in Gaza. So the United States and the American people are deeply implicated in this slaughter, and it's right and proper that people in the United States should be demanding of their politicians that they end this. I feel complicity is too weak a word. The US is a full partner in it. This is just as much an American massacre of Palestinian children as it is an Israeli one.
Well, when I wrote about Gaza this week, I had to end it with a quote from Thomas Jefferson, who said, I tremble, and we know about his sins, but who said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. And that's the gravity of the crime we're committing, I think will be, by many people, sadly, only understood in years to come, but I'm hoping we can stop it well before then. So, Ali Abunimah, thank you for your great work in this area. I encourage people to read electronicintifada.net, I believe it is, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ.